Mr. Andrew Case is the digital forensic researcher and trainer. He has traveled many miles to come here, so I'd like everyone to give a big hand, Tampa welcome to the man, the myth, the legend himself, Mr. Andrew Case. And one more thing, there is a happy hour that we're sponsoring at Gators Dockside. It is actually half a mile from Mosey. If you leave the museum and make a right, go away from the university, it should be on your left-hand side. The happy hour will run from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock, so everyone's invited that you bring a friend or bring your thirst, and we'll see you there. That is courtesy of our friend Deborah Wildquest. Thank you, Wildquest.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear off this mic? No? Okay. Hoping it doesn't squeak in my ear. How's that? Better? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you've had a good day. There's been a lot of interesting talks. I'm going to be speaking on the need for active threat hunting and some strategies that you can use to bring it into your organization or improve the process if you're already performing it. How many people have done threat hunting before in their environment, looking for adversaries? Looking? Okay. How mature would you say your process is? Is that something you do on your own, or is it something the organization does as an ongoing flow? Is it kind of ad hoc? Okay, so I talked to a few people today that I know do IR. It seemed kind of ad hoc. So we're going to talk about some ways, the technical things you should look for, but then also kind of how you can get it into a real process within your company. For those I've not met before, my name is Andrew Case, and I spend most of my time working on memory forensics, incident response, and malware analysis. One of the core volatility developers. I saw several talks today that mentioned volatility in different ways. And I'm also the co-author of The Art of Memory Forensics, the book that was given out during the raffle. If you haven't heard of the book before or seen it, it's over 900 pages covering memory forensics and malware analysis across Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's essentially a brain dump of everything the volatility developers knew as of 6 months ago. So we put a lot of time and effort into it. Before getting into incident response, I spent several years working on the red team side of the house. So I was doing reverse engineering for vulnerability discovery, source code audits, penetration tests, and the normal sort of set of things. I found this to be very helpful, though. Understanding how attackers broke into systems, the type of maneuvers they would do, how malware looked, how vulnerabilities looked, and then moving on to the defensive side was very helpful. I knew what the logs were going to look like, I knew where they were going to be stored, and I kind of knew how they would manifest in memory. If all you've done is offense before, I would definitely recommend learning defense. And on the same hand, if all you've done is defense before, learn how to do pen testing, learn how to break into systems. If you understand what the attackers are doing and how they're going to move in, you're definitely going to have a better chance of finding them and stopping them. So why is threat hunting so important, and why did I choose it as the topic for this presentation? I did so as it's currently the most effective method for any organization to combat modern threats. We're obviously losing this fight. People are compromised all the time. Attackers are on the network for long periods of time, and most companies don't have an effective way to deal with that. And when you're dealing with adversaries that have large budgets, when you're nation states, you're real criminal enterprises, only if you're organized and prepared do you have any chance of dealing with it. You also have to be active. One of the big parts of this talk is that your organization needs an active approach to defense, not a reactive state where you're waiting for an alert to trigger or something visible to happen. You need to go looking yourself. And for those of you who have performed incident response, you're quite aware that one of the most difficult aspects is sifting through all of the data. You need to take all of the logs that you have, all of the information from the live system, and figure out what's normal versus what might be an artifact of an attack. And the reason this is so complicated is because of how complex modern systems are. If you saw the previous talk, if you saw the talk from Ryan earlier, when you look at, say, the list of processes, there's hundreds of them. When you look at the network connections, there's going to be a large amount of them. Without understanding what we call normal of the system, what should be there, you really have no way of finding the attackers and then eventually getting them out of your systems. And through threat hunting, that's how your organization can get there. You will have deep examinations of systems. You'll know exactly what they're supposed to look like. And after that, you can have a fighting chance against the attackers. They're still going to break in. They're still going to be on your systems. But you're going to find them in an effective way. And then the other thing to realize is that no matter your budget, you could have $1 billion to spend on security tools, on forensics tools, but there's no combination of tools that can tell you everything you want to know about your network. They can maybe alert you to something, but if you've seen real attackers in action, if you've read the reports, they live on the network a long time before they're found. And then even if you have some agent or network sensor that's going to tell you there's an attacker here, or the attackers moved to this system, or they were on a certain system, those aren't going to do response for you. Eventually, a human's going to have to move into the process and actually root those attackers out of the network. So if you take someone who doesn't know your environment, doesn't know the systems you run, the applications you run, they're going to be at quite a disadvantage, and they're probably going to lose. No one's going to raise their hand anyway if I ask, but if you're fighting nation states on a daily basis, these people are smart. It's their day job to break into systems, to stay on networks, steal as much data as possible. You're not dealing with amateurs. So if you bring in investigators who don't have that same amount of knowledge, you're going to keep losing. And nothing shows this more than when you look at the statistics about attacks. Attackers are on networks for months or years before they're noticed. And if you look at how most of those organizations eventually figure out that the attackers were there, it's by third-party organizations. The FBI notifies them. A vendor that has access to different taps in the internet or other networks, they notice that a network is attacked. The network and the network's owner don't figure it out on their own. They have to wait for someone else to do it. It's inexcusable that attackers on the other side of the world know your networks better than you do, or that your IT staff does. In some cases, I can maybe understand it, how these attacks persist for so long. You do have very skilled attackers. They have advanced ways of exfiltrating data and moving around the network. But on a realistic side, if they're moving gigabytes of data outside of your network, if they've compromised every machine of the thousands on your network and you don't detect it, that's not a state you want to be in. That's not a good way of dealing with incident response, and it's definitely not a good way of attacking the problem. I've seen that many times firsthand, though, and it's not pretty. It looks bad on the IT team. It looks bad on really everyone involved in the organization. We've had a few examples of this. One incident I was working, we were kind of trailing behind the attackers, figuring out what machines they moved to, and eventually we found a machine that they were on and left some files around. All the other ones that we had found, they were active, they deleted the files, so we could see maybe the file names or some remnants of the files, but we never had a good set of data. But then on this particular machine, they didn't remove the data, they didn't do any anti-forensics, and what we essentially found was an export of every vulnerability scanner within that client's network. So the attackers knew every vulnerable machine. These scans were very new, so most of them were not patched, and then that's where they chose to attack, and they just wiped through the whole network, hitting every vulnerability there was. We brought this information to the client, and at first they thought we basically did a pen test while trying to do forensics. They had no idea how we got that much insight into their network, how we figured out where the attackers moved so quickly, but all we did was follow their steps. And when we presented to the client, we said, this is what was compromised, this was what was compromised, all the different machines. They didn't even know why. They had no idea what was important on those machines, what the assets were. They had shadow IT. Are people familiar with that term? Just stuff in your network that you don't even know what it is. It's not tracked. That held some of the company's most sensitive information. So it wasn't until we found out what the attackers did, we went on the machines and found the data, that the company had any idea what was there or why the attackers were targeting it. That's definitely not the position we want to be in as defenders. In another instance, another instance that highlights how bad the situation is, the attackers had moved onto a network. Again, this is a different client, but the attackers had moved onto the network. They then found all of the resources that they wanted to steal, and then they disappeared for about 2 weeks. Again, we figure out this time frame by doing IR after. But what we saw was that they came back 2 weeks later after moving around the network, finding all the resources they cared about, and they came back with very targeted malware. And they launched the malware. It was different samples throughout the network. It was launched from specific machines. It targeted certain data on certain servers, and it pushed it all out across the network. So after these attackers came back and launched their custom malware, it was about 3 days later, and literally every penny of IP that that company had now sat on servers in China. And again, we had to reverse engineer the malware. We had to figure out what machines it was targeting, what data it was targeting. And we brought this to the client, and they had no idea what was going on. They had never heard of most of the machines. The DNS names were not familiar to them. The IP addresses, the subnets were not familiar to them. And it wasn't until we pulled disk images and started showing them the data that they realized basically every penny that they've ever spent on R&D was now within another organization. Again, that's inexcusable. That's not how defense in IT should be. And as we'll talk about, through threat hunting and a more proactive stance, that can be a thing of the past, and you won't have these problems anymore. So with that said, what exactly is threat hunting? Several blog posts cover this concept in detail, and the best of which were written by either current or former GE people. They do this very, very well. The best two examples, which I have referenced here on the slides, are from Sean Mason and Jack Crook. So these are two of the guys who really built out GE's IR process globally. And the main idea behind threat hunting is a move from the reactive state of incident response, so waiting for a HIPS alert or an IDS alert or one of those FBI notifications, to proactively looking in your environment, understanding your environment, knowing the resources that are there, and actually going looking for attackers. So I can pull memory from a machine, I can pull disk from a machine, and I don't have a specific indicator that I'm looking for. I just want to know, is this machine in an abnormal state? Is it in a state that shows that an attacker is there versus normal running of the system? But again, this is not how incident response teams traditionally worked. It's in the name. An incident response team means some type of incident happens, and then the team comes in and fixes it. But again, that reactive state just doesn't work. It's failed for a decade now. It's not getting any better with the adversaries getting better. And IR needs to move into a more proactive state. It also needs to become more active within the overall organization. If we're going to go through a few slides, but the idea is if you look at how security is embedded in an organization versus how the IR team is embedded, they're quite different. And the IR team is always going to be lagging behind, and it's kind of by design. If you look at how they fit into the organization, it's almost hopeless for them to keep up. Now let's talk about the benefits of threat hunting. The first benefit is that, again, you have that move from a reactive state to a proactive state. And what that's going to do is make the job of the attackers on your network much more complicated. If you look at skilled adversaries and how they work, they know that they can evade every security tool on the market. And the only way they're going to get caught is if they make a mistake. If they leave patterns across networks that, say, the FBI picks up on, if they break a machine, if they brick a machine, if they force it to reboot, they basically have to screw up if they want to be caught. On the other hand, hiding from an active team is much more difficult. If you have someone that's constantly pulling memory, constantly looking on disk for indicators, and taking the current state of the system versus what is the known good state, and we'll talk about how to get there, it's much harder to hide from. And even in those cases, even no matter how skilled the attackers are, how well their malware is written, how well they're embedded into the system, you're still going to be able to find them. Another major benefit is being able to find gaps in your system and application configurations. A common example of this is audit logging being disabled. When you have that enabled, in the event logs, you're going to have every time a user logs on, every time a user logs off. You can even set it to do it every time a process is created, the full command line of the process. But most people don't turn this on. It's not enabled by default. So you have to actively talk to your sysadmins, talk to the group policy creators, and make sure that's there on the system. Another major issue is privileges. And I'm going to go through an example of this in a few slides, but if you're familiar with the concept of least privileges, running with the least privileges you need, this is not done in organizations, and it allows attackers to move much more freely through the network. It allows them accesses to resources that, if privileges were granted correctly, they just simply couldn't do it. And the last two benefits we're going to talk about are your defender's familiarity with your network. So I'm going to go through a series of questions shortly. And if you're a defender, if you're a manager of a team that is in charge of incident response or forensics, and they can't answer these questions, or you can't answer the question yourself, then that's a problem. It means you're not familiar enough with your environment to really be doing effective incident response. So as I'm going to go through in the next few slides, understanding normal it's a hard task. You're not going to walk out of this with one script that you can run on every machine and immediately understand normal. Modern networks and systems are made up of many moving parts. They're very complex, and so it's very hard to say, what is the normal state of a system? Imagine if you had a router. What's the normal state of a router? There's always connections going through. There's files being pushed through. Look at your email server. What is the normal state at midnight versus in the morning when everyone gets in and downloads their email? So it's an ongoing thing, and it's not trivial, but by the time you get normal figured out, your IR is almost instant, or it's almost scriptable, because all you want to know is what's different on the machine now versus when it's in its normal state, and you're looking for those differences. And again, to make this work, you're going to need someone who deeply understands your systems. I can certainly tell you what's normal on, say, a default install of Windows 7. If you install Windows 7 with, say, Chrome or Firefox or normal applications, they can pretty quickly figure out what's supposed to be there or not. If you give me a random computer from your accountant's office or one of your lawyers or one of your HR people, and they have 20 different applications that I've never heard of before, those are going to very much change what is normal in the system. They're going to load processes. They're going to make network connections. If you have security software, they're going to load kernel drivers. And again, without seeing those before, that's going to be very hard for me just to intuitively figure out what's there. I'm going to have to sit on Google. I'm going to have to research the products. But again, your internal team, or depending on how closely you work with a third party, they should know what's there. You shouldn't be in the middle of an incident guessing, why is this connection being made? Why is this process running? And again, as the purpose of the talk, threat hunting is what fixes this. Threat hunting removes guessing. It removes not knowing what's normal, and it really puts you in the only position that's going to give you hope of defeating attackers. So what we're now going to do is look at a subset of the data that defines normal. This is applicable to both end users and servers. And the purpose of this is to highlight just the wide range of data that an analyst needs to look at in order to determine if a system is compromised or not. And again, most people, I talked to quite a few people today, most people work in big enterprises. So imagine trying to do this on one system versus 1,000 systems. When you don't know what's compromised, when you don't know where the attackers moved, you need some way to very quickly weed out the data and figure out what to focus on. And again, without previous threat hunting and the baseline that it provides, it's going to be very hard to do, and it's very likely that you're going to make errors. Another thing to realize is that while some of the terms I'm going to use are Windows specific, because I assume that's what most people are familiar with, the same exact thing applies to Mac and Linux. And again, you're going to have to go through all this to understand normal. Linux is obviously seen in a lot of data centers on the servers, and many organizations are now allowing Mac inside. So even if you've perfected this for Windows, you need to start understanding those other platforms as well. The first set of data we're going to look at is running processes. If you pull up Task Manager on Windows, if you run pslist on the command line, you'll see that there's hundreds of processes running on the machine. Malware only needs one of those to completely take over the system, to inject code into other processes, to hook what's being typed on the keyboard, to hook network flow. And because of this power that just one process can have, gathering a list of running processes is one of the first things you do in IR. When you look at volatility, if you saw Ryan's talk earlier, one of the first things people do, they get a memory sample on the machine, and they run pslist. If you saw the previous talk, you can run sysinternals and procmon, and it's going to give you the list of processes that are there. But as I said, on a default system, you're going to have many processes running. So if I was to hand you a list of processes, say 250 of them for an average of a server, can you actually look at all those and definitively tell me this one's malicious, this one's normal? Could you do that without a baseline? It's going to be very difficult to do that. Again, when you throw in third-party applications from all the different random departments of your company, it pretty much gets impossible to do that just off your own knowledge. Sitting on Google is obviously non-ideal, but I've definitely been in underprepared IR teams from a third-party perspective, where I'm asking them, okay, there's this process running. What does this do? And they're calling people in the IT department, or they're sitting on Google on their phones trying to figure out, what does this belong to? Is it legitimate? Is it malware? Also remember that process names are not really the best indicator. A lot of malware is going to run as servicehost.exe. It's going to run as like conhost.exe. You need something more. So you can look at what path it's running on disk. You can look at where it started, where it fit within the process chain. But again, if you don't know all of that, something else has to tell it to you. It's also very difficult to do at any type of scale. And then another point to consider is the relationship between processes. This can be very different depending on how it looks. So you have those service host processes, and again, it's quite different if it's running from where it should be in Windows or if it's running from a user's temporary directory. On the other hand, if you see command.exe running and it's a sysadmin's machine or it's a developer's machine, maybe that's normal. And if it's spawned from conhost.exe, then that can be seen as expected. The person opened up command.exe and was working from the command line. On the other hand, you can use sysinternals on a live machine or pstree from volatility, and if you see command.exe being spawned under Internet Explorer or Adobe Flash, then you probably have a problem that you want to look into. But again, without that Windows internals knowledge, without that familiarity with what normal should look like, that's going to be very difficult to do. Patrick Olson's blog post on this is a very good example. He spent quite a bit of time researching what are normal processes on Windows, the relationships between them, and not only is it a really great resource from the forensics perspective, it also shows how hard it is to do. If you would print his blog post out, it would be 15 pages just full of stuff you're never going to remember off the top of your head. And that's only processes. We're about to go through 6 or 7 more artifacts that are just as hard to track, and in some case harder. And again, one mistake in the malware goes undetected. If I give you the list of 250 processes and you miss one, or you say, oh, that's servicehost.exe or that's command.exe, it must be normal, well, now malware is on your system and you just missed the infection. The next place we'll talk about where normal must be understood is privileges. Adhering to the principle of least privilege is definitely not easy, and it's also very easy to make mistakes. These mistakes can be very costly, though. Imagine if you have someone running as local admin, and then they get hit by a phishing attack, and now someone's walking around the network with a pass-the-hash attack, versus if privileges are correct and the attackers are stuck on one machine. That's obviously quite a bit of a different situation for your organization. An example of this, I was working a case not too long ago. Again, I was kind of in as like a third party helping out with the IR, and I was in the lab. Someone went to the machine that was infected. They brought me back a memory sample and select files from the Windows system. What I mean by select files are the files that have forensics relevance, not just everything off the disk. Part of these files that came back were the prefetch directory. Assuming no anti-forensics was used on the machine, the prefetch files can tell you essentially every file that was executed. So in this case, there was a piece of malware that was run that the user downloaded. They tried to download something off of SourceForge, but they got redirected to a malware site because they had a malicious never quite figured out. I'm pretty sure it was a malicious advertisement or some JavaScript got injected. But in the prefetch file, I could see where the malware was run. That's going to tell me the exact second that it was first run on the machine. And I noticed in the timeline that immediately after that, the task scheduler was run. So after seeing that, I asked for the scheduled task directory of the user. That wasn't part of the files that I originally got. And sure enough, the malware had created a scheduled task. And what this scheduled task did was every 3 hours it would run. It would make sure the malware was still active and persistent on the machine, so it would check for the registry keys, and then it would also contact a command and control server. So as I was doing this analysis, I told the IR team that I was helping out, look, you have this scheduled task that was performed by the malware or planted by the malware, and not only is it on the system, but it's running as the system account. System is the most privileged user on Windows. It can do whatever it wants. So I told the IR team this, and they flat out told me that my analysis was wrong, and I got something wrong along the way. I showed them the output of the script, which, I mean, I'm not making this up. The script tells you what it runs as, and it said system. So they came back and said that can't happen because the employee that was compromised, every person in his department, they don't get to run as local admin. They run in a non-privileged state. So at that point, I pulled out volatility to get the final answer. Got the memory sample. I used the plugin that shows you all the processes that are running along with their privileges. And I showed that for every process related to that login session, sure enough, they were running as local admin, just as I had told them before. A few days later, I was on site for a while. A few days later, they came back to me and said, oh yeah, we had a misconfiguration in Active Directory. Everyone in that employee's department was running as local admin. Obviously, if this was not just some lame piece of malware that I was looking at, and this was a targeted attack, well, now the attackers can remote into that machine as local admin, pass the hash, dump passwords, and so on, and it's probably pretty easily get to domain admin and take over everything. Versus if that Active Directory permission issue would have been found before and the group would have been locked down, the attackers would have been stuck to that one machine. And this is something that threat hunting is going to find. You're going to pull memory off of someone's system out of that department. You're going to look at privileges. You're going to look at processes. You're going to see what power they have on the machine and say, you know, why does Joe in accounting need to be local admin? You can get that fixed before the attackers find it. But only through that proactive stance to your own defense do you have any chance of doing that, versus waiting for the attackers to exploit it, and then after the fact you go back and fix it. Another area that's important to understand normal is expected network activity. If you've never run netstat, or you've never used a tool that will show you the network connections of a production corporate system, you're going to be horrified. There's going to be 10, 20, 30 applications that are making connections to wherever they want to connect. There's going to be processes waiting for incoming connections. And if you look at that without any reference or baseline to know what should be there or what shouldn't be there, it's going to be pretty much hopeless. And again, during an active incident is not when you want to figure this out. You want to know which ones are legitimate or which ones are not. Some more horror stories where, again, I was brought in as like a third party for these. Had an incident. A machine was beaconing out to the network based on NetFlow data. We also thought that it was accepting commands from other machines on the network. So essentially, the attackers were coming back in through that machine. I sat there with a memory sample, sat there with volatility, and I started asking the IR team, okay, this process is listening on this port, or this process is connecting out on this port to this IP address. Is this valid or not? They had no idea. They were sitting on Google trying to search it. They were calling their friends in IT who would maybe help them quicker than the ticket system. And in one extreme example, they actually called tech support of the product, begging them to tell them what ports does this listen on and does it connect out on the network. This organization, the IR, was so disconnected from the IT process that calling tech support and kind of begging them for answers was quicker than just getting a new machine imaged. If we could have got a fresh machine image that hadn't touched the network, definitely didn't have malware, all we'd have to do is boot it up, take a memory sample, and compare what we were getting. Essentially, we'd be doing threat hunting kind of during an incident. But without previous threat hunting, which they obviously weren't doing, and all of the documentation that it creates, they were pretty much hopeless. They had no internal knowledge base of what it should be doing. They had no idea what normal looked like. And so it was one of the most inefficient responses I've been a part of, because we simply didn't have data to support what we were looking for, to give us any answers. And then another area where network activity really highlights how important threat hunting is again finding those anomalous artifacts. So how many people run software firewalls on all the machines in their network, even if it's just Windows firewall being turned on? Okay, so probably most people. If you look at that, those firewalls are going to have exceptions. People need to be able to do web browsing. They need to be able to contact file shares. If you have any type of video conferencing, many times those applications talk on really weird UDP ports. So your firewall is going to have exceptions of applications that should be able to contact the network. But again, during an incident is not the time to figure out what those settings are and what they look like from a forensics perspective. Malware and active attackers will poke holes in the firewall. They will grant exceptions to their own applications. And if you took a stock install of Windows 7, it's really obvious if malware.exe has an exception. Pull a corporate system, though, where people actually have to get work done, and it's going to have 45 exceptions for all these random ports and random applications. If I have to sift through those again and figure out, okay, why is this there? Is it group policy? Did it come with the base install of the system? Does the application poke its own hole in the Windows firewall? That is just wasting time over and over again. And I'm going to have to do that for every system that's part of my investigation. Instead, if you had a baseline of what normal looked like from that system, and you saw normal in action through your threat hunting, there is no guessing at that point. In some cases, it boils down to the diff command. Tell me what's different in the config now to what the current state looks like, and then I can just look at the differences. Another thing to consider is kernel level rootkits. So these are going to operate with full power over the system. To gain access to the kernel, they're going to load a kernel driver. So there's going to be an executable. The operating system is going to provide some built-in way to load these into the kernel address space. And at that point, the rootkit can do whatever it wants. And unfortunately, it's not too easy, if you're not familiar with the system, to figure out what are legitimate kernel drivers versus the abnormal ones. Also, because of the power that kernel-level rootkits have, it's one of the most important things you need to figure out. You definitely need to know if malware is in the kernel or not. Again, without threat hunting and all of that baseline knowledge and documentation, this is going to be really painful. If you would take a default install of Windows 7 and you would get a list of the loaded kernel drivers, you're already going to be looking at over 100 of them, probably somewhere around 140, 150. If you then look at your third-party components, your security tools, any type of driver for a USB camera, a microphone, these random hardware devices on your machine, they're going to load their own drivers as well. So again, do you want to give your analyst a list of 150 drivers, or do you want to say this is the one driver that's on the machine now that wasn't there when we installed it? As an example, hopefully you can see the bottom of the slide. The last bullet of the slide lists the names of 4 drivers as you would see them from a tool like Volatility against the memory sample, or from a tool that you ran on the live system. MRXNet and MRXCLS are Stuxnet, while MRXSMB and MRXDAV are legitimate Windows components. Without baselining, your ability to detect Stuxnet or not is basically your analyst knowing that off the top of their head and not screwing it up. Another thing to consider is the only reason I know the 2 Stuxnet drivers is because people did analysis on it. And they said these are the malicious ones. If someone had never heard of Stuxnet or some other malware, they're going to say, oh, all these drivers have MRX as a starting point. They probably have something to do with the network. This machine's clean. Meanwhile, your network's infected with Stuxnet. The next place where normal needs to be understood is common persistence mechanisms. These are a pain. They're very hard to deal with. Traditionally, they were a bit easier, so malware would focus on the run keys. On the system, there's going to be a set of keys that specify which program will run every time the system boots, and then what programs need to run when certain users log in. This is obviously a very nice target for malware, and it's been targeted for the last 15 years or so. Unfortunately, the run keys are not the only source of persistence. Adam's blog series on this, called Beyond the Run Key, is currently around 27, I think it's 27 entries. He posted a new one yesterday on all the different ways that you can make malware persist on a Windows system without touching the run keys. So again, most people probably, I certainly don't know all of those off the top of my head, or at least how to look for them. And if you don't have a baseline, do you really want for every disk image that you get to go look at 27 different places and look for, not just look at those places, but figure out which ones are legitimate components versus malware? Scheduled tasks are another place where this is very helpful. Scheduled tasks, when you look at your nation-state backed groups, this is one of the most common ways that they gain persistence on a system. They drop a scheduled task. The triggers for scheduled tasks are pretty wide-ranging, so it can be when the system starts, when the workstation locks are unlocked. The reference I have to the MSDN gives you the entire list of triggers that you can use. But the idea is you can specify actions, including programs running or drivers loading, at very specific times. So not just when the system boots or when the user logs in, for a wide variety of actions. So threat groups really like using scheduled tasks to get data running on the system or get their programs running on the system. And again, if you look at a normal Windows install, you're going to have 100 of these or 50 of these at the very least. Do you really want to look at those and try to memorize them, or do you want some way to quickly difference the data? And then the final persistence mechanism I'll talk about is services. These are extremely powerful. They allow you to load kernel drivers. So you start the service, the kernel driver gets loaded into memory, and then depending on how you do anti-forensics, you can remove the service from the list, but your kernel driver is still going to be loaded. Another thing you could do with a service is load your DLL into a shared process. So you might have 15 services all running inside of the same process. So now when you're doing memory forensics, it's not just there's a service host running, there's a service host with 20 services running. Which one of these are malicious? Again, without a baseline, it's going to be very difficult. This isn't even just a time saver. This is very easy to get wrong. You get someone who's an expert with memory forensics, volatility, Windows, it's still very easy to screw this up. And then the last area I'll talk about through kind of this exercise of emphasizing why you need to know normal, is your antivirus and your HIPS product. I had several questions about this today. We use volatility, but we also have security products on the systems, and they inject code everywhere. Volatility picks up on the injected code, but you trace it down, and you're like, it's just Symantec, it's just McAfee, it's just this other product. Again, if you have some way to your normal system before any infection can happen, and you know what those code injections look like from your security tool, then when you see a code injection from malware, it's going to stand out as quite different. But again, without threat hunting and documentation of the results, it's hopeless. It's going to take forever, and you're just going to keep going down rabbit holes that end up being legitimate components and essentially waste time. So everything that I talked about in the last several slides takes time. So obviously looking through all those processes, figuring out what should be there, takes time, and also takes an experienced analyst. Don't take your junior person who just joined the team and try to get them to baseline your systems. It's likely they're going to screw up. So if your organization is dedicating the time and your senior level resources to do this, it's essentially a complete waste of time if it's not being documented. You want for those things that I mentioned, plus quite a few others, you want to know what normal looks like. You want to know a way that's easily searchable, easy to difference, and then you can take that information and diff it during live engagements. How many people have read the Phoenix Project before? The book by Gene Kim? A few people? Okay, so if you haven't read that, consider it required reading, kind of no matter what your role in IT is. But the idea here with this bullet that says, do not allow Brents to be created, is if you don't document what your organization knows and what's being learned during threat hunts, as well as responding to actual incidents, you're going to create silos, and you're going to create Brents. In the book, Brent is the whiz kid in the company. The book kind of follows a major IT organization, and they have Brent who knows everything. He knows how the network's configured, the architecture, all the servers, all the applications. And the problem is everything in the organization serializes on Brent. If something breaks, Brent has to stop and fix it. If 2 or 3 things break at once, well, Brent has to fix A, then B, then C. And nothing else gets done unless Brent's doing it. The same thing can very easily happen in your own organization. If you have someone who knows everything, the person doing your hunting, the person who leads all your investigations, and they don't document and share that knowledge, all you've done is create a Brent. And if that person leaves, if that person's sick, if that person's just on vacation around the world, you have no effective response at that point. And one thing that kind of drives this home is the last bullet point. If your entire IR team were to get up and leave, if FireEye was to come in with $1 million and say, we're taking all of you right now, how long would it be before you had effective response again? All your institutional knowledge is going to walk out the door if it's not documented, and everyone that knows your network is going to leave. Versus if you had effective documentation and you had ongoing training and processes, you could bring new hires in, throw the documentation at them and let them sit there for a week, and now they know your network and your resources just as well as the people that left. And that's where you need to be. I'm sure if you deal with hiring, if you're a manager, turnover is very high. If you have skills in this industry, you can go to one of 1,000 companies whenever you want. So between the turnover and between people leaving for better money, better opportunities, if you're creating Brents, if you have 1 or 2 or 3 people that know everything, you're definitely setting yourself up for failure. So if you implemented everything I just discussed to a T, what does your IR team and your overall organization gain? Again, the biggest thing is you're moving from a reactive to a proactive state of managing threats. No more receiving, blacked out letters from the FBI saying you've been compromised. No more saying this much data left the network from one of your providers. You know when the attackers are there. If you're doing small-scale hunts once a week, once every 2 weeks, well, that's the gap where the attackers can be on your network before you're going to find them. The other thing is you're going to have effective response. Don't be like the places where I've walked in and we're sitting there Googling process names, or we're Googling kernel drivers trying to figure out what's going on. Know your environment. You certainly want to know it better than the attackers, and after a while you're just immediately going to know what's there. If you have developers in your organization or even people that can just script things out, eventually you'll get to where you're running the diff command, or you're taking a script that you wrote and you're diffing the known state, the normal state, versus what the system currently looks like. And then the other thing is you need to follow through with the documentation. That needs to be forced onto people, make them actually document what they find, and then roll that into internal training. So with that said, how do you get there? You really need 2 things there's 2 goals you need to reach if you want effective threat hunting and if you want it to benefit your organization as well as it can. The first one is the executives need to understand the value of a properly prepared team. If your team is constantly swamped with useless alerts, so if every time someone logs in after lunch, or every time someone's machine shuts down, or some random update comes in, if alerts are being generated and your IR team is constantly consumed with that, you might as well give up. They're not going to be able to prepare for a hunt. They're not going to be able to set up the processes to do hunting effectively, and then they won't even have time to do the hunts anyway. So you need to be able to break out the team, prioritize your alerts. Sean's blog that I referenced before has some really good advice on that. But you need to be effective. And looking at 1,000 alerts a day that really aren't that helpful is not a good way to use your team. And then the other thing is, which we're going to go through, is the IR team needs to be integrated into the organization. We're going to look at how security is integrated, and we're going to look at how IR is not integrated. And we'll see the issues that that creates. So again, if you look at this, in basically every organization, every mature organization, security is everywhere. So security is involved in the rollouts of applications, the ongoing security. They're in the planning meetings yelling at developers that they can't do certain things or they're going to give away all the customer data. But how many times have you seen an IR team member there? How many times have you seen a person from the forensics team in those meetings or in that planning? So if you look at the pre-deployment phase here, we're going to look at pre-deployment and post-deployment. There's a few things, kind of comparisons. So before an operating system ever touches production, before an application is ever rolled out to production, it's reviewed for security issues as well as security compliance. In fact, there's entire companies that provide these services. You have companies that will come in, do your source code reviews. They'll do the baseline analysis. There's no such equivalent to that in forensics. There's no companies that do the same thing. If you look at Microsoft's Baseline Security Analyzer, it's a free tool that almost does this for you. So Microsoft realized the importance of this. They wrote a tool for it, and it basically does configuration checks of your install. If you look on the app development side, there's an entire methodology around the secure SDLC. This is how smart people sat down and figured out, how can we embed security within the development team? We want to find vulnerabilities as soon as they're committed to source code. We want to find them while they're still within the dev environment. And we never want vulnerabilities in our code to reach production. On the cloud development side, Rich Mogul has done some really great work in the DevOps side of this. So taking security as well as security policies, and through the entire DevOps life cycle, you see security there. Nothing's ever done where there's not security considerations in the process. And again, in mature organizations, this is just seen as normal. Security is embedded in IT, and IT can't do anything without kind of security sign-off. And then on the post-deployment cycle, it's the same thing. You have dedicated vulnerability scanners. You have if you have an internal red team, they're constantly trying to break systems. Otherwise, you're bringing in third-party companies to do pen test. And you're trying to figure out, is everything up to date? Are the patches up to date? What can be compromised? And then if something's found, which it often will be, it's immediately dealt with. A severity 1 ticket's created. This application needs to be fixed. This server needs to be updated. And kind of everything deadlocks until that is done. On the other hand, if you compare this to kind of how IR is within the organization and the power they have and how they're embedded into the ongoing flow, there's really no comparison that you can make. IR is nowhere to be seen except when an incident happens, and then everyone's yelling at IR until the attackers and the malware is gone. But this can be fixed if you change your processes. So again, if we look at the pre-deployment phase, IR should have just as much input as everyone else does. Those misconfigurations where there's no audit logging on, where logs are being truncated to small sizes that are kind of ridiculous, all of that can be fixed before anything touches production. Also, when you look at your application install, so from third-party companies, many of those have settings, and they can log a lot of data. But again, if no one's looking at what can be logged and the types of logs that they create, that's never going to be written out. And then when you go to do forensics, you say, man, this app could have logged exactly what we wanted to know, but because we weren't proactive about it, that logging wasn't turned on. So we can turn it on now, and then if we get popped in the future, maybe we'll find it, but we lost our best evidence. And then if you're developing internal applications, you need to make sure that it's auditing. Anything that you can reasonably think a user, a rogue insider, or an attacker is going to do should be logged. And it should be logged in a way that your forensics team can go back and find it. It's pretty inexcusable that a rogue employee that wants to rip you off, or an attacker that comes in through the network, can use your own applications against you, and you didn't build forensics into them. If they use the application to steal employee data, personal information, healthcare data, why isn't all of that logged somewhere? So when your forensics team comes behind, they say, this is exactly what happened, this is the time it happened, this is how they got in through the system, and now you actually have effective forensics in your organization. And the end result of this is everything that's in production is ready for forensics exploitation. The artifacts are there. They're logged they're logged in a way that the team knows how to find them and how to parse them. And then you're enabling really the best investigations you can get. And then on the post-deployment phase, it's the ongoing threat hunting. You need to know what the applications look like when they're actually deployed, what the systems look like as updates happen, as applications are updated, and all of that needs to be documented. And if you don't do this, you're going to quickly fall behind. If you only do the pre-deployment phase, if you only know what the baseline looks like, you're going to fall behind. The applications, again, when they update, we've seen major changes in Windows. We've seen major changes in third-party applications, push in more DLLs. You'll see security tools that got burned by a piece of malware. They now add 100 more hooks to the system to try to find it in the future. And all of that's going to break your existing, what your existing baseline looks like and what your existing normal looks like. And then another place where IR needs a lot of support is incident preparedness. Too often, an incident happens, the IR team has to scramble to get access to data, and you end up dealing with horrible resources. I recently had to work a case where they said, we don't have any extra hardware to give you. We can give you this machine to work on. I figured out I wasn't even on native hardware. I was in VMware. It had 4 gigs of RAM and 1 virtual core. And then they gave me 3 terabytes of disk images and 10 memory samples. And at first I thought they were joking, but that was the only thing they could spare to me to work on the case. And I basically told them, OK, I'm going to kick the tools off and come back in a month, and then we might have results. Versus if they had dedicated hardware and dedicated resources to work with, that's not going to be a problem, and you'll have actual effective response. So I have a list here. This is certainly not comprehensive, but it's definitely a good start. Your IR team members should be able to monitor portions of the network. Obviously, most places don't want full PCAP, or they can't afford it, or the engineering is just too difficult. But if you don't have that, and there's an incident, or if I'm threat hunting, I should be able to monitor subsets of the network. It's very hard to track where attackers are going, or to see how data flows between machines if I can't look on the network. Another place is dedicated storage servers. So if I want to store disk images, memory samples, select file pulls, if my tools are generating output that I want to save, I should have dedicated storage for that. How many people have heard of CryptoWall, or the Friends of CryptoWall? How many people have seen the IR team, because of lack of preparedness, have to authenticate to production file servers to store data? If anyone will admit to that. I see people laughing. That's as good as a hand. What if CryptoWall was on the machine that you're investigating? And you connect to that file server because you need the extra storage to store data. Well, now your corporate file server has just been encrypted, and now you're fighting ransomware. And that's not an extreme example. It's happened to more companies that will ever admit it. If it wasn't for backups, if it wasn't for tape, they would have lost everything they had. And they lost the data that was in the delta between when they backed up last versus what people were doing work for. Storage is, especially if you're talking a couple terabytes of storage, depending on the size of your organization, that's dirt cheap. Give the IR team their own file servers. Don't let other people use it, and let them store the data as it's generated and as it's needed. You also need to have your applications pre-deployed. I've seen teams say, OK, how do we acquire memory during IR? And they're going out to Google. They're downloading Dumpit, downloading other tools, while machines are compromised, and while that data that we wanted to capture was quickly leaving memory because time was burning. Versus if you had VMs already developed, there's free VMs you can download that have tools. You can build one out yourself, or just to have the tools inside your company ready to be pushed out. Then you can quickly get the data. You can get it in a state that you know is going to be reliable. And this is where hunting really helps. If you get someone new in the organization, they've never pulled memory before, they've never pulled disk, they've never used PSExec, they've never used fresponse, let them do it during the hunting. And if they screw up, it's not that big of a deal. There's no active response at that point. But if they perfect it and they know how to do it during hunting and while they're getting used to the environment, then when you have that real outbreak, you're not blue screening the machine because the person pulled memory wrong. You're getting a valid memory capture out, and you have data that you can work with. And then the other thing to do is make sure that you're utilizing the documentation. As you're doing hunting, as you're finding these artifacts, they need to go somewhere. I don't really have an off-the-shelf solution for this, like some documentation product. We kind of rolled our own and customized one. But you need some way where every member of your team can say, okay, this other team member knows what our email servers look like and knows what they should look like in memory. How can I find that? Even if it's just a wiki to start, this is what the process is I should see. This is the kernel drivers. And through that documentation and forcing people to do the documentation is how you get to that step. Another big benefit of threat hunting is adding to your internal training. So if you look at some of the work Jack's done in the public space, Jack Crook from GE that I mentioned before, he creates very realistic forensics challenges. These are things where if you get someone who's never done forensics, if they want to see memory forensics, if they want to see what very realistic attacks look like, give them one of Jack's challenges. They're modeled after exactly what he sees hitting GE's network. But as great as his challenges are, and as much as you can learn from them, they're still public. So this is not specific to your environment. But as you're doing threat hunting, you're taking disk images, you're taking memory captures, why not roll those into your own internal training? Take a memory sample that has malware on it, take a memory sample that has an active attacker on the system, and store it somewhere. Put it on secure offline storage. Someone new comes into your company, and you want them to get familiar with what does volatility look like on the system, what does FTK look like on the system, what does encase look like on the system. Use your own images. Use the data and the files from your own environment. That way, when they see it again, they're that much more familiar with it. But again, if you're not doing threat hunting, you're certainly not going to have that. And if you don't have the resources, the hardware resources and the network resources that the team needs, that's going to be hopeless. And then your internal training is going to rely on other people's environments and other people's view of the world versus your own company's view of the world. And then the other thing, besides benefiting your internal employees, is documentation and threat hunting really helps third parties. I kind of explained some of the bad situations I've been in, the very headache-inducing situations. And something to realize is that very few organizations outside of GE, Lockheed Martin, and those can handle all of their breaches internal. If your entire network got compromised right now, you'd probably be calling a third party to come in and help. And when you think of what knowledge a consultant that's coming in for the first time has, it's basically the same knowledge that your new hire has. They know nothing of your environment, nothing of what it should look like, and you're paying them a ridiculous amount of money. So if they have to sit there a week while you generate documentation and you install tools and you try to explain to them what things should look like, or if every 5 minutes they have to ask you questions, hey, is this normal, is this normal, is this normal, that's not effective. You're wasting your company's money in a sense. You're kind of wasting their time because they can't just do analysis. They don't know what anything's supposed to be. And that's very ineffective response. Versus, I walk into your environment the first time, you say, here's a 10-page PDF of what everything should look like. Or, we need you to analyze this Windows 7 sample from accounting. This is what it should look like. There's no more guessing then. And I can work on my own, and I don't have to bother your team while they're trying to respond as well. Again, in the example with the Brents, you can't do anything at scale if only 1 or 2 people know everything. And then this is the only graphic I have in the deck. But this was a tweet that I got back. I asked on Twitter, I believe it's when I was asked to do this talk or when I was talking about threat hunting at a different conference. And basically someone replied, the reason more companies don't do threat hunting and they don't take it so serious or that they don't understand the value is there's no compliance function for it. There's no checkbox that an auditor is going to say, do you do threat hunting? And when is the last time you had a threat hunt? But if you look at the number of breaches in the last 2 years, if you look at the severity of them, executives definitely know about this. On the other hand, and I'm definitely not a lawyer, but if your company has cyber insurance, which if your company is worth more than $1 million, say as a low estimate, you probably have cyber insurance. And if you look at the due diligence clause within those policies, they're going to say you need to be actively preventing breaches on the network, you need to be working to detect them, and once they're detected, you need effective response. Sitting on Google and searching process names and ports and applications is certainly not effective. And then if you're I've been on both sides of this. If the, I forget what they're called, like the insurance auditor or the person trying to figure out, did you meet your contractual obligations, they're going to say, okay, well, how did you look on your network? How do you know your network? What type of response did you have? And you say, oh, well, Brent over there knew everything and we just did whatever he said, versus, hey, here's our 50-page PDF of documentation. This is how we actively work on our network looking for threats. This is how we respond when certain threats are found. That's going to look a lot better. And depending where you work also, if you ever have Congress knocking on your door or any of the other regulators, giving them a blank piece of paper that was written the day before is going to look really bad versus having documentation of what you should have been doing all along and what your company was actually following through. One other thing I briefly wanted to touch on was spending inside of organizations. So due to some of the compliance issues I talked about and just kind of the deeply ingrained thoughts that most organizations have, they shift a lot of money towards penetration testing and vulnerability scanning and application assessments. And this leaves the IR team with very little resources. Again, in most organizations, IR is thought of something after the fact. You sit in a corner by yourself, something gets popped, people get into the network, you go fix it, and then you go back to your corner and leave us alone otherwise. In reality, that's a pretty silly approach. No modern network is unbreachable. In fact, most organizations, whether they admit it or not, is one phishing email away from total disaster. Think of some of the biggest attacks. RSA, several others were phishing emails. Once the attackers got in the network, they could roam around where they want and take the data they want. And the other thing to consider is no matter how good your internal red team is or the third-party company you bring in for a security audit, and some of them are obviously very good at what they do, they're not going to match the resources of a determined adversary. If you look at some of the documented attacks against big companies, you're talking threat groups that spent months, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, patiently probing around a network, trying to break into the network before they finally got in. If you hire one pen tester for 1 week, how does that really compare to that attack? Versus, do you have the budget to hire a 20-person penetration testing team 24/7 for 3 months? And if you're not getting pen tests on that scale, you're not matching what someone like China, Russia, or an organized crime group is going to do when they decide they want your data. The other thing to realize with these same groups is they don't play by the same rules. You might write a scope of engagement for your pen test that says phishing isn't a valid way to get in, or this application server is new, so you can't break into that one. The person in China doesn't care. They're going to get in through whatever means they want, and it's simply impossible to replicate that level of determination and kind of endless scope through a penetration test. So if you accept that you can be breached, and that if a determined group decides they want to get into your network, that they're going to get into the network, then you're going to shift where you focus your spending. I have it on the slide here. I'm sure everyone's heard of shell shock. But if I was to say, hey, I just got an update on Twitter, shell shock 2 is out, or some equivalent vulnerability for Windows just came out, would you feel better knowing that yesterday your vulnerability scanner said, hey, the whole network's cleared and we're fully patched, versus I have an IR team sitting in the SOC or sitting in the office, and if machines get popped or when machines get popped, we're going to have very effective response? I know I would rather have the response, because even if you're fully patched, even if your applications have been tested for vulnerabilities, your network is only, quote, secure until another vulnerability comes out. And vulnerabilities come out all of the time. Versus IR, where once you get the process rolling, once you have effective response in your organization, that lasts essentially forever. As long as someone's keeping the processes up, as long as the budget stays behind it, that's not going anywhere. So only have a few minutes left, so I'm not going to read this, but these are steps you can do. So if you wanted to take it to a manager and say, we need threat hunting, these are the steps you could follow. So you want to make sure that, again, your IR team needs time to do it. Another thing to realize is you can start small. Make sure you get the process down right. Make sure that you're documenting what you want. If there's gaps in the documentation, then refine your process. And then you can move to full-scale hunting and really start understanding your environment. This is, again, steps on embedding IR into IT. When the slides get uploaded, I can put some slide notes on here to kind of flesh out some of the points. But these are the things, if you're going to get IR into the IT processes, this is how you're going to do it effective and not waste time. So in conclusion, hopefully you see the value of threat hunting by this point, or at least trying it in your environment, trying to get that understanding of normal. When it's done correctly, it's not only the most effective way to stay ahead of modern threats, it's really the only way to do it. Reactive simply doesn't work anymore. Hasn't worked for a long time, but in the last couple of years, it's really come to the forefront. If you're not actively looking for vulnerabilities, if you're not actively looking to figure out what should be on my system versus what shouldn't be there, you're going to lose. And eventually, you're going to have an FBI notification. You're going to see your data being sold in a black market somewhere. Attackers are going to get in, and they're going to take what they want, and you're never going to know the difference. Versus through this active view of defense and actually figuring out your systems, you have a fighting chance. And in most cases, you can very easily, maybe that was overstatement, you could somewhat easily get the attackers out and at least find them on your systems. So that was all of the slides. I can now take any questions or comments if there's still time. All right, one question.
What do you see as the role of threat intelligence, Andrew, into the hunt teams? How would you?
OK, so the question was, for the video, what do I see as the role of threat intel during the hunting process? Good threat intel, so kind of targeted threat intel, not just like a billion indicators of whatever. That can obviously be very helpful, especially on the network side. So if you see, depending on where you place that, if you can look for lateral movement inside the network. That can look for files being transferred. That can see where the outgoing connections are. And then you also have indicators on the host. So assuming malware is not interfering with, say, the list of processes that's being generated or the network connections, that good threat intel, that's decent can be very helpful. And that can really help with the scalable and the automation part of it as well. Did that answer your question? So yeah, it's definitely useful as long as your threat intel is not here's every IPv4 address with no context or something like that. So, yes? It's called the Phoenix Project by Gene Kim. The Phoenix Project. And that's not me just saying the book's awesome. It's a tech book that has over 800 reviews on Amazon or stars on Amazon. You really should go ahead and read it. Jack in the back is giving me 2 thumbs up for that. That one. Online resources for daily security topics? Was that the question? So one of the best ways I keep up with security, which might sound silly, is TweetDeck. So on Twitter, even if you never post, you can use TweetDeck to automatically search for terms. So I think I have like 60 search terms in mind. So anytime someone talks about forensics, vulnerabilities, memory forensics, disk forensics, I see what the tweet is. And that's not just people actually posting. A lot of those are like RSS feeds that feeds off of blogs and other things. On the forensic side, another thing you do is go to Harlan Carby's blog, windowsir.blogspot.com. Not only is his blog good, but he has the blog roll on the right that lists pretty much every other blog that's relevant to forensics. So I do that pretty often as well. And then there's some mailing lists. So there's the Win Forensics mailing list, the Paul.com mailing list, Daily Dave. We have a volatility mailing list that's open to anyone if you care about memory forensics and the malware stuff. Keeping up with those kind of is very good for keeping up with latest things. So, yes.
One of the things that you mentioned on the first few slides was that doing hunting without indicators. And I don't know, like, work with a lot of groups, and that's what hunting is. They'll get intel, they'll have here, and they'll hunt on their network for system affect us. And I just wanted to clarify, so you're essentially saying that by understanding the network, baseline everything from network perspective, host perspective, whatever perspective, and then measuring the variances from that, that's your recommended methodology for threat hunting, in this case without indicators?
Yes, so the summarized version of the question was hunting with indicators, so like the threat intel versus just taking the delta of the good state versus the current state. Hunting with indicators certainly works. If someone said this big piece of malware came out or this big threat group likely compromised your network, yeah, I'm going to start with the indicators and work there. But kind of, I guess the holy grail would be the best term I can think of forensics is, and that's how we deal with memory forensics. I don't care what a specific piece of malware is. If you look at volatility, it doesn't have an indicator for Stuxnet, right? Or any of the other big pieces of app malware. But if you run volatility on them, it's going to find it 10 different ways. So again, the holy grail of forensics is not an indicator of this or a hash of this or a string of this. I just want to know, should this be on the system or not? Or was this on the system the last time I looked? And if you have that deep operating systems internals knowledge and you can look at that delta, then I mean, I could do forensics all day without indicators. I really don't ever use them unless I need to know like the specific piece of malware or the specific threat groups. I just want to look at that delta. So was there questions?
Trying to do like, I guess, scaled automated type of hunting. What all areas would you suggest that you try to collect the baseline? I guess some areas of the registry and certain ones, or if you're going to try to do targeted collections on certain systems, try to do something.
Yeah. Okay. So on the disk side, like what we call select files would be the registry hives, the prefetch. If we're looking at end user activity, we'll put like the link files and the jump list. We always pull the scheduled tasks folder just because of how important that is. I have an actual list I could send you if I could look at it, but off the top of my head. And then obviously memory as well, so we can do memory forensics against it that way. So.
Definitely agree that helps have a baseline to go with incident response. What's normal? How do you see larger organizations being successful in scaling it out? This baseline, when you're not looking to run it up physical memory dump on one system, you have tens of thousands of systems. And thousands of them have different profiles as far as what processes would be running, what network connections they would have, physical geography they would be located in.
So the question was, how do you scale not only size, but also or number of nodes, but different configurations, different applications, obviously different countries. Even if you change the language pack, that'll change stuff a lot. There's no like automatic solution to that. You really just need baselines of what's there. I mean, one thing you can do is, let's say, everyone in accounting across the world uses one application or something. You can baseline that application. So even if you don't have an automated way to diff it against that machine, or the diff might get polluted, you at least know that these 10, when this application is running or this background service is running, I should see these 10 processes. So at some point, though, you have to do the baselining. If you can script it out, then it's going to work. We've done some stuff with VMware. With VMware snapshots, you can get a delta of the disk. That VMDK, I forget the extension, I think VMDK is like a delta of the disk. You can also take a disk image before and after like applications install. For the registry, there's a tool called Redshot you can run on the live machine. And then in memory, it's volatility and all the plugins that we care about before and after, say, an application was installed. One interesting thing you can look at to build on, it's called DAM. It's called like differencing analysis in memory. It's open source on GitHub under 5.0 Forensics, but it's meant to use in a VM, so you can like run an application, run a piece of malware. You take a snapshot before and a snapshot after, and then it automatically does the diffing of all the plugins for you. So that's a good way to automate it. But again, you can't get around the baselining, so you need to scale out resources or like automate the process as much as possible. So unfortunately, I don't have like a script I can give you to make that easy.
Right, so sort of taking from an application perspective, profile and catalog of approved applications for your environment. So then we get into the response scenario on a system. At least most of them know what it is.
Right, exactly. And imagine if your baselining took you from there's 250 processes to there's 8 we need a question. And then if you're many times like we scope out like everyone say on the same like VLAN or something depending on the network. If you figure out those like 8 kind of extraneous processes, and then you go to the next machine and you see the same 8 processes, you've already kind of done the research. And then if you document what you did, when you come back a month later, you don't have to do it again. So it definitely builds. And if you have an internal team that keeps the documentation rolling, you get to a point where there's not a whole lot of guessing left. You just know what's going to be there or not. So yeah. Did that kind of answer your question a little bit? Okay. Any more questions? Yes.
This is a question that I always ask, and it's more of a business question. But essentially, it's a one-word question. It's metrics. Like how do we prove to business people that what we're doing, giving them metrics?
There's a few ways you can do it. So as in many cases, if you've been compromised before and you can show that this is how long we took to respond to the incident, this is the resources we had to dedicate, this was the end result, versus here's a hunt. So here's like a mock scenario. You can even like throw malware on a test system and say, with this new process, this is how long it took, this is the documentation that resulted, and if we would have a same or similar outbreak, it would take even shorter, because you're narrowing that gap of unknowns on the system, and you know like what's anomalous or not. So, or even if you haven't compromised, just throw malware on a system, say this is how we do it now, give us some funding to do hunting and documenting, and this is how it'll look 2 months from now or something. So, any other questions? Okay, thank you for your time. Hopefully you enjoyed the presentation.